friends, let me today story tell you Man with the Twisted Lip by British detective author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm sure you must have heard about him. The Man with the Twisted Lip is one of the 56 short Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Is the sixth of the 12 stories in the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The story was first published in Strand magazine in December 1891. Doyle ranked The Man with the Twisted Lip 16 in a list of his 19 Sherlock Holmes favorite stories. The story goes as follows. Late at night, Kate Whitney, a friend of Dr. Watson's wife, calls on them. Her husband, Isa, has been absent for several days now. Frantic and worried, she begs Dr. Watson to fetch him home from the opium den where he goes regularly. Watson does this, but in the process he also finds his friend Sherlock Holmes in the opium den, disguised as an old man seeking for clues of the frequent visitors to the place. The case involves Mr. Neville St. Clair, a prosperous, respectable, punctual man who has gone missing. His family's home is in the countryside, but he visits London every day on business. One day, when St. Clair was in London, Mrs. St. Clair also goes to London separately. She happens to pass down Upper Swandam Lake, an unpleasant and narrow road near the London docks where the opium den is located. Glancing up, she sees her husband at a second floor window of the opium den, but he vanishes from the window immediately. This insinuates Mrs. St. Clair that something is wrong somewhere. She tries to enter the building, but her way is blocked by the opium den's owner, a Lascar. A Lascar is a kind of a manager, generally an Indian or from Southeast Asia. So she tries to enter the building, but her way is blocked by the opium den's owner, a Lascar. She calls out the police, but they do not find St. Clair there. The room behind the window has a dingy animal den where a dirty, disfigured beggar known to the police as Hugh Boone, is found. The police puts her story down as a mistake of some kind when Mrs. St. Clair notices a box of wooden toy bricks that her husband said he would buy for their son. A further search discovers some of St. Clair's clothes also. Later, his coat with pockets stuffed with hundreds of pennies and half pennies is found on the bank of the River Thames, just below the building's back window. Hugh Boone is arrested immediately, but he denies any knowledge of St. Clair. He also resists any attempt to make him wash and cleanse. Holmes initially is convinced that St. Clair has been murdered and that Boone is involved, so he investigates in disguise. He and Watson return to St. Clair's home to a surprise. It is several days after the disappearance, but on that day, Mrs. St. Clair has received a letter from her husband in his own handwriting with his wedding ring enclosed, telling her not to worry. This forces Holmes to reconsider his conclusions, leading him eventually to a very extraordinary kind of a solution. Holmes and Watson go to the police station where Hugh Boone is held. Holmes brings a bath sponge in a Gladstone bag. Finding Boone asleep, Sherlock Holmes washes the sleeping Boone's dirty face, and that reveals that he in fact is the real Neville St. Clair. St. Clair has been leading a double life as a respectable businessman and also as a professional beggar. In his youth, he had been an actor before becoming a newspaper reporter. In order to research an article, he had diagnosed himself as a beggar for a short time, very short period, and collected a surprisingly huge amount of money. Later, he was saddled with a large debt and returned to the street to beg for several days to pay it off. His newspaper salary was meager, and so he was tempted to beg that got him larger sums of returns. He eventually became a professional beggar. His earnings were large enough with which he was able to establish himself as a country gentleman, marry well, and begin a respectable family. His wife and children never knew what he did for a living, and when arrested, he feared exposure more than prison or the gallows. And there is no murder in this story, friends. So this guy was only hiding. He was leading a double life as a beggar and as a normal citizen. So he is released. Finally, this guy is released, and Holmes and police agree to keep St. Clair's secret as long as they don't hear of his second personality, that is Hugh Boone. So it's a very interesting story, friends. A silent version of The Man with the Twisted Lip was filmed in 1921. In 1951, Rudolph Cartier produced an adaptation entitled The Man Who Disappeared. This adaptation was a pilot for a proposed television series starring John Longden as Holmes and Campbell Singer as Watson. In 1964, the story was adapted into an episode of the BBC series Sherlock Holmes, starring Douglas Madden as Inspector Lestrade and Anton Rogers as Neville St. Clair. The adaptation developed St. Clair's attributed ability at repartee by showing him quoting from classics including Shakespeare. Granada Television also produced a version in 1986 adapted by Alan Platter as part of their the return of Sherlock Holmes television series. The Man with the Twisted Lip was dramatized for BBC Radio 4 in 1990 as part of Bert Kuhl's complete radio adaptation of The Canon, starring Clive Merrison as Holmes and Michael Williams as Watson. The 2014 Sherlock episode, His Last Vow, begins with Sherlock being found in a drug den by John, reminiscent of the scene in the opium den from his story. So friends, these were some of the adaptations of the story, but it's an interesting one. You must find time to read this. And that's all for today. Goodbye and see you soon.